Classical recording was the first adopter, I'd say a very early adopter of that technology. The sound floors were much lower, and it's very much more transparent than tape, and of course no intermodulation distortion, no crosstalk. The early days of it, I think, were not particularly that good. I've listened to some of the very earliest digital recordings, and they were running them alongside the analog ones. I had 8-track analog at the time, Dolby A multi-track recordings I think they were running, and then they had this digital format as well. And the quantization noise is unbelievable when you listen to it now. You know, you just never would ever think about hearing that anymore. But at the time, you know, there were 12-bit recordings, I think, or 14-bit, but it actually had 12-bit converters, and they would flip. Two of the bits would flip. This is the predecessor to the JVC and the 1610 that EMI was using for certain. Yeah, used to run on great big computer decks, computer, you know. And that was just before me. I was in the business at JVC when JVC was it was a sort of a battle between the JVC format and the 1610 format, which was recording on pneumatics. Just out of college, I got a Christmas job at EMI, EMI Classics. No, EMI Records as it was a classical department of EMI Records UK. And they just wanted a little bit of Christmas support to help keep the record shop supplied up. But luckily the department was right next to the human resources department, so I became familiar with the faces in there, and they were very kindly managed to get me an interview at Abbey Road, and I met Ken, and I think he wanted me up there, but I think they'd already filled the vacancy that they had, so he found me a temporary job up there. And then it was only a few months really before he moved me down to work with Peter Baum, doing digital transfers. I think he was at the end of his time there, and he was doing transfers. Yeah, I did physics and music at college, so there was a studio there, but it wasn't really a very I was a blank piece of paper, really, as far as when I came to Abbey Road. I learned everything that I know about recording from the people at Abbey Road and the people who come through Abbey Road. What to do and what not to do. You see some extraordinary things that people get up to, and you think, probably won't try that one. Well, I mean, if things are going badly in the studio, I see people just digging the holes, and they won't really listen to what the problems are, and the best thing to do is just to tear up what you've done and just start from scratch. Just if it's not working, you should really just completely change your setup to something that is going to work, and then after a while you get to know what works and what doesn't work, and then you use that as your starting point. And you watch other people and see what they do, and maybe try that as an alternative starting point. So I had a very esoteric record collection. I was, when you're 13, you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your life. I particularly enjoyed the recordings that EMI made at King's College. It's just lit my candle. And at the time, there were only two names on the back of the record. There was Chris Bishop, who was the producer, and Chris Parker, who was the engineer. And I sort of said to myself, I think I'm going to set my sights on being either one of those guys. That'll do me as a job. That sounds quite interesting. So having arrived at Abbey Road, I think within about 4 or 5 months, I was actually apprenticed to Christopher Parker, and I just couldn't believe my luck. What seemed to be just like a kid's pipe dream, I'd actually arrived. See, at Abbey Road, the record keeping at that point, the session logs and so on were very detailed, and because often a project would be spread over weeks, months, maybe even years, so they'd have to come back and completely recreate the setup in the studio, and this was all before Total Recall and computers, so everything was meticulously marked out by hand, what mics we used, the gain on them, any EQ, and the levels of the faders and so on. So it's pretty easy to recreate, to get back to that, and to recreate the sort of sounds that they ended up with, and use that as your starting point. So really invaluable. Perhaps not so much now, because the climate is very controlled, but I think before the temperature was going up and down like a yo-yo in there, and the humidity. And some engineers I won't mention actually like to have it quite warm in there, and they would, the musicians would come in and absolutely swelter, and it was comical, and pretty well at the first break there'd be fisticuffs, about the temperature. But
so especially these days in the war.
Yeah, now the temperature is controlled. It's sonically it's the other thing which would affect the studio is maybe if it's raining, people will come and bring their coats in, and so you'd have maybe an extra 50 square meters of carpeting in there, which is bound to have an effect on the sound, umbrellas and the humidity. It all has an effect, but it's a small effect really to the way the musicians are playing and just the way they're gelling on that particular day. That's a way bigger effect than the acoustics. I think the essence of making a good classical recording is the marriage of the acoustic and the instrumentation. And certain venues will lend themselves to smaller groups a lot better than to larger groups. So once you've got that nailed, I think that's half your battle done as far as the sound is concerned. If it sounds good in the room, there's no reason why you can't make a really good recording out of it. So Abbey Road 1, for example, is the perfect venue for large orchestra, chamber orchestra, and but for some things it's just a little bit too big. It's nicer to have a smaller venue. And a more controlled venue, because it's quite live in there. Lovely for orchestral music, but if you wanted to do something a little notey and intricate, you'd want a slightly drier place. So there are halls around which we go to. There's plenty of location equipment around that you can take out and have fun and play with on the road. I think on a good classical recording, the goal is to keep it as pure as you can in terms of your technique. So to use as little processing as possible. In fact, if you can use absolutely no processing, that is the peak of what you're aiming to achieve. Keep the signal path really, really clean. As I mentioned, having really nice acoustic. And
what about whether you use a lot of mics or listen?
Yeah.
Small number of mics?
I think if you can use as few mics as possible on a classical recording, that's you're probably going to end up with the best result. Not necessarily the same for other styles of recording, but for classical recording, the fewer mics, the better the result as a rule. Very much depending on what you're recording will affect the mic technique. First of all, you need to seat the players very carefully. I mean, that's I'm slightly obsessive about seating players. I will actually put every chair out myself personally. I think it's just about the most important thing, because the relationship of the player to the microphone is absolutely key. You know, if you're using very few microphones and you have a large or even a small group of musicians, you know, just that relationship is so important. And you know, 6 inches away can make an enormous difference. I mean, I've seen people move microphones a few inches, and that's, you know, it's a joke. But 3, 4, 5, 6 inches, you know, it's a big difference there.